Hello, my name's Ben Hales with Transform My Poker. What's the difference between a railway guard and a poker coach? One minds the train, whilst the other trains the mind. I slipped that in there because I don't know about you, but calling stations always strikes me as a slightly strange term, makes me think of a physical station and trains, and so that's why you got the silly joke. I know that many of you struggle with beating calling stations because I get so many emails about this subject. So for all of you who struggle with beating calling stations, this is the video for you. You're going to find out all about what they do, why they do it, and how to beat them. So all aboard, let's get on track, and off we go with the first slide. What mistakes do calling stations make? This is the starting point, because this is always the starting point when we're talking about trying to exploit opponents. We need to think about what they're doing wrong first in order to then adjust our games in the correct manner. So if you're talking about how to beat a rock, you do the same process. You start with what mistakes are they making, and then what adjustments do I need to make. All right, and that's what we're going to do today for calling stations. So first up, they play too many hands pre-flop, and this means they have very weak ranges throughout their hands, which puts them at a disadvantage in terms of their showdown potential. Second up, they play hands out of position. They'll play hands from early position, mid position, late position. They play hands everywhere. So this makes them much easier to exploit. It's a huge mistake. So they're playing too many hands. They're playing hands from the wrong positions. What else are they doing wrong? Well, they're being too passive. Often calling stations will be seen limping pre-flop, or calling raises, or calling out of position. And then post-flop, their tendency is going to be also to be too passive. So you will see them being quite honest in the way they play. They'll call, whatever they've got, but they'll only raise when they've really got something. So they'll call when they're weak or average, and then they'll raise when they're strong, and they don't do much folding. So that's their behavior. This is what they're actually doing. And then the final point on this slide is specifically to do with the post-flop mistake of calling with weak hands. And this is where they lose lots of money, because they're constantly arriving at showdown with really weak ranges. Occasionally they get lucky and win big pots, but more often than not, they're going to lose. So that's what they're doing wrong. Now, how do we exploit those mistakes? Well, let's start with a simple thing. Pre-flop, when you get a big hand, raise it strong. That means, where once you might choose 3 times the big blind, you might choose 5 or 6 times the big blind. If you normally choose 4 or 5 times the big blind, you might choose 7 or 8 times the big blind. If there's lots of calling stations at the table, it's not unheard of or irrational to go even bigger than that. That's the adjustment you need to make in order to exploit these types of mistakes. Post-flop, we're going to be betting strong when we are strong. So it's the same theme. If we've got a good hand, either pre-flop or post-flop, we're betting strong for value. No longer is half the pot a normal bet size. If we're playing against calling stations, pot size bets are the norm. Over betting the pot becomes okay. There are times when it makes sense to bet twice the amount in the pot because they're calling, they're calling with anything. So don't be afraid of big bet sizes, especially when you have a strong holding. The third point on the list is to avoid all forms of bluffing. Makes no sense. If we're playing against a calling station, then bluffing is the absolute worst thing you can try to do. Keep all your bets for value. Yes, it makes you more predictable, but calling stations tend to be playing on level 1, level 2 type of thinking. So you don't need to be playing elaborate poker in order to beat a calling station. Keep it simple, avoid all forms of bluffing. That means all forms. Okay, sometimes you might think of a continuation bet as a normal bet, but sometimes that C bet is as a bluff. Cut them out, stick to the value bets. That's how you're going to beat calling stations. Okay? Every time you make a bet, think, is this a value bet? Is it a bluff? If you ask that question, is it a value bet? Is it a bluff? And if you answer the question with, oh, it's kind of a bluff, then no, don't make the bet. And that's good advice for beating calling stations. Now, the final thing on this slide is to respect aggression. I mentioned this before. It's a clear sign of strength. A calling station is normally a very straightforward player. So when they raise, check raise, re-raise, that means they're probably very strong. It's not in their nature to go raising with bluffing hands or weak hands. Okay? You will see it, so you may get bluffed off a pot by folding, but that's always the case with any opponent. But in general, you need to just be respecting their aggression. And this is a point where some of you are falling over. I know, because I see the hand histories, I see what people are doing wrong. When calling stations act out of character, they're raising, that means you should be super tight and fold most of the time unless you're very, very strong. Good. Let's carry on with our thoughts on how to beat these friends of ours, the calling stations, and exploit their mistakes. I call them friends, of course, because I'm always happy to see them. You should be too. So the first point on this slide, be happy to see flops with calling stations. If there's lots of calling stations and there's lots of limped pots, it doesn't always make sense to go with the tactic of raise big and try and isolate to one opponent. That can be the right play. It can work well, especially if you've got a good value situation. But often simply getting involved, seeing a cheap flop, and then if you hit big, you win big. Very often someone will call you down and you've got 2 pair or better. And if you miss, well, never mind. You give up a small amount of money. It's a risk-reward ratio that is stacking up more and more in your favor, because the implied odds of hitting a good hand, you're getting really well paid post-flop by calling stations, because they'll just keep calling you down. So yeah, definitely be happy to see cheap flops. I don't want you playing really, really wide ranges against calling stations, but when you've only got to invest a small amount to see the flop, it makes sense. If you've got to pay a lot, so you're calling a raise, then you need to make sure you're playing a tight range against calling stations, and you want to be going in with a good range advantage and preferably with position. Second point, expect to get sucked out on sometimes. Now, this is an important point from the mental part of the game. You are going to lose sometimes. They're going to hit draws or catch a lucky 2 pair on the river. It's just a part of the game. You can't avoid it. There's going to be some big swings against these types of players, but if you stick with these principles, you're going to make money against them, I promise you. All right? So take the rough with the smooth. Sometimes things will go wrong. You'll have some downswings, but overall, calling stations are hugely profitable players to be playing against. Third point, I've already mentioned this in the previous slide, but doesn't harm to say it again. Do not be afraid of huge bet sizes. It's not wrong to bet big. I think there's often a feeling of, oh, what's a crazy bet that was when that player bet that huge bet. Well, it's only crazy if your opponents know what they're doing. Then it's perhaps crazy. But if your opponents are calling stations, huge bet sizes could be the most logical bet size available to you. Finally, on this slide, don't forget to value bet relentlessly. So this means whenever you have the strongest hand, or you believe you are ahead of your opponent's range, you should be betting. And bet big when you're way ahead of them, bet slightly smaller if you have thin value, and don't forget to bet if you have thin value. You might not think that they should be calling with bottom pair on the river, but they probably will do. So you can get more value out of hands like just one pair hands, like a top pair hand, than you think. So sometimes traditional play where you should perhaps check a street isn't going to be the case against calling stations. Don't forget to value bet. You can make more money out of them than you think. And they are my tips for beating calling stations. I have one final word because I want to be really, really clear about this. Beating calling stations is not difficult. This is one of the easier parts of poker. You can do it. Don't overplay. Don't overthink. Follow the principles from this video. Keep things really simple. And I promise you, you can make money from calling stations. My name is Ben Hales with Transform My Poker. If you enjoyed this video, please do the Facebook likes, comments, questions. I'll endeavour to get back to you. I always enjoy hearing from you, and have a great day. Thanks very much for listening. Bye for now.